Hey everyone, here's a video about the great Buzzy Drootin. And I'm really excited to talk about Buzzy. He's another of my absolute favorite drummers. He's been a huge influence on me for a long time. And he also has a special place in my heart because he's one of the few guys from that era that I actually got to know and hang out with a bit and become friends with to a certain degree. I'll always be very grateful that I got to spend some time with him. And he's another guy who just had his own style, just an incredibly swinging drummer who put together a variety of different influences to come up with a unique way of playing. He didn't sound like anyone else. I keep saying this about all these different players that I'm making videos about, but it's true about all of them. That's the amazing thing. When I was first discovering all these players, that was the thing that really struck me, that under this umbrella term of traditional jazz, you could have such a diverse group of players, and under that heading you could have Buzzy Drootin, you could have Paul Barber, and you could have all these guys who are all great, but were so different from each other. And even just within, let's say, the Eddie Condon band, because I've always felt a particular connection to the music of the Eddie Condon band, especially from the 50s. I just love that band, every configuration of it. And just the three main drummers who played with that band during that time, George Wettling, Cliff Leeman, and Buzzy Drootin, they're all so different from one another, and it's so amazing. And it was so amazing, especially for me when I was first hearing these guys, to hear these people playing with the same band at pretty much the same time, and all of them sounded so great with that band, but they were all so different. And it's the same as Bobby Hackett and Wild Bill Davison, both sounding great with that band, but being so different, or Peanuts Hucko and Pee Wee Russell. And that was really a lesson to me, and I think it's a great thing to keep in mind, that you should never feel constrained playing this music, because it allows for infinite creativity and self-expression. There are so many ways to approach it. And I have to admit, and this is a little embarrassing because he is one of the drummers who is most important to me and one of my favorites, but I have to admit that I didn't totally get Buzzy when I first heard him. It took me a minute. I heard George Wettling first with the Condon band, and I related to that right away. I loved it. And then I heard Cliff Leeman, and I loved that too. I didn't know it was Cliff Leeman because the recording wasn't labeled, but I responded to that right away. And then when I first heard Buzzy, it took me a second because it was such a different approach and so much not what I was expecting for that band. But it didn't take me too long to realize what a brilliant player he was, and from that moment on, he really, as I said, became one of the most important drummers in my life, and someone who I think about quite a bit, and that's why I sought him out and got to know him. I was so amazed. Wait, Buzzy Drootin is still alive? I gotta go meet this guy. So his style, I think he was really influenced by Dave Tuff, Joe Jones, and Sid Catlett. Sid Catlett in particular. I think Buzzy was really coming from Sid Catlett. And it's another interesting way you can compare him with some of those other drummers. Like George Wettling has a very direct Baby Dodds influence, and Buzzy doesn't really have that. He's influenced by Baby Dodds, obviously indirectly, and pretty much everyone playing drums is influenced by Baby Dodds and people like him, at least indirectly. But again, Buzzy's really coming from Sid Catlett, and he's also younger than George Wettling or Cliff Leeman. Buzzy was born in 1920. He didn't know exactly, but he thought 1920. So he's around the same age as Shelly Manne. He's just a few years younger than Max Roach. He's a little older than Art Blakey or Kenny Clarke. So, like any great drummer, he was a product of his time to a certain degree, and he was part of that generation, and he was influenced by those guys, I'm sure. And he told me that he was really good friends with Charlie Parker and Miles Davis and a lot of those guys, and hung out with them a lot. He said he didn't play with them all that much, but they were friends and they hung out. So you can hear that kind of influence in his playing, and it's important to remember that his favorites, Joe Jones, Dave Tuff, Sid Catlett, those were the favorites of Shelly Manne and Max Roach and a lot of those guys. And then they all found something different to do with those influences. And while those guys went in more of the Charlie Parker direction, Buzzy was able to have all those influences and make them work with Eddie Condon or Bobby Hackett or Jack Teagarden, Sidney Bechet, all these people. So he really had this just great combination of influences. And just to talk briefly about his setup, because he had sort of two main setups that I think about. In the late 40s or early 50s, he was usually using a piccolo snare drum. In fact, it was a Gretsch Max Roach model piccolo snare drum. And that was something I asked him about. I was just curious because that drum was so much advertised as, oh, the new sound of bebop or whatever, which is obviously just silly. But I just was curious how he came to be using that drum with the Eddie Condon band and other groups like that. And he just said, oh, well, that was the hip new thing at the time, and I was young, so that's what I played. And it's very interesting that he didn't really think about it, and he also wasn't thinking about equipment necessarily matching a style. And strangely enough, because he used that piccolo snare drum with all the groups he was playing with, that influenced other people in that style to use a piccolo snare drum. And I used a piccolo snare drum for a while, and it was directly from Buzzy's influence. And also Cliff Lehman, I mentioned in a video about him, he used a piccolo snare drum sometimes. So all these things kind of blended together in different ways, which is what makes it cool, I think. So Buzzy would have the piccolo snare drum, and then he'd have his hi-hats, and he had a ride cymbal without rivets, then he had a Chinese cymbal, usually further to his right with rivets, and then sometimes on his left, he would use a smaller cymbal that he would play kind of these Dave Tough sort of fills on. In the video I made about Cliff Lehman, Cliff would do similar things on a little 8-inch splash cymbal, and I demonstrated some of those. And Buzzy would do similar type fills on this cymbal. It was slightly bigger, it was maybe 10 or 12 inches. But again, these kind of cymbal fills you would associate with Dave Tough. And then a little bit later on in the 50s, he switched to a more conventional depth snare drum, a 5 or a 5.5, and he dropped the small cymbal and the Chinese cymbal, and then he would have two ride cymbals, the regular ride that he had without rivets on his right, and then a ride cymbal with rivets on his left. And he also often only used one tom-tom, and in the late 40s, early 50s, it was usually just the small tom. George Wettling did the same thing, often just had a small tom and no floor tom. And then later on, you'd usually see Buzzy with just a floor tom and no small tom. And I'll make another video. This one I'm going to talk about mainly things he played with bands and his setup and everything. I'll make another video about his soloing style, but his soloing was really based off the snare drum, and he wasn't doing a lot of around the drums sort of thing, so I guess he didn't need a lot of tom-toms. But another thing that really set him apart was how he would switch cymbals. And I mentioned this, that Cliff Lehman was an early guy with this too. These guys don't really get credit for this, but they were really switching ride cymbals, whether it was two different ride cymbals or a ride cymbal and a Chinese cymbal as a ride cymbal. They would really switch back and forth. And again, to me, that's coming directly out of Dave Tough and Sid Catlett. And if you have heard the Bud Freeman and his famous Chicagoans recordings from 1940 with Dave Tough, I can't recommend them highly enough. Some of the greatest drumming ever. And the way Dave Tough switches cymbals and switches his sound with every different soloist, that's the kind of thing you'll really hear Buzzy doing. And for instance, you would hear Buzzy maybe play the first chorus of a tune, the ensemble chorus, on the ride cymbal, then go to the hi-hat for the piano solo, back to the ride cymbal for the trombone, maybe to the Chinese cymbal for the trumpet, back to the ride cymbal for the clarinet, closed hi-hat for the bass solo, and back to the ride cymbal for the ensemble chorus out. Those sort of things really, I feel, are coming from Dave Tough and Sid Catlett, and if you hear Sid Catlett with Louis Armstrong, Satchmo at Symphony Hall, you can hear Sid Catlett doing that kind of thing too. In fact, I think Buzzy Drootin was at that concert, if I'm remembering this right. But so that sort of thing is interesting because not everybody played that way. A lot of guys in different styles of jazz just used one ride cymbal. Like George Wettling usually just had one ride cymbal. Gene Krupa just had one ride cymbal. And even some of the later players who had two ride cymbals, Max Roach or Art Blakey, they'd often concentrate on one cymbal. Shelly Manne would do that too. So Buzzy, that thing of like really switching back and forth with every change in the music, I feel is really coming from Dave Tuff and Sid Catlett, and Buzzy was definitely a guy who carried that on. And an important aspect of his sound, he had his snares on his snare drum very loose. I tried to, you can get that, but he had a high-pitched snare drum with the snares pretty loose, and I've heard that that's how he got the nickname Buzzy. I'm not sure if that's true. I don't know why I never asked him about that, but for some reason I didn't. But definitely had a unique snare drum sound if you compare it to, let's say, George Wettling's snare drum sound, which was much crisper. Buzzy had this very identifiable snare drum sound. It sounded great with both sticks and brushes, and the rim shots had a particular sound because of that. And an element of his style that was different from Wettling and from Cliff Lehman, he would often double the ride cymbal beat with his left hand on the snare drum. And he often didn't play as many quarter notes on the ride cymbal as, let's say, George Wettling would, but he would double the ride beat on the snare drum. So his basic thing would kind of be like, actually, Buddy Rich always did that same thing. Buddy Rich would always double the ride beat on the snare drum at any tempo. And there are certain similarities between Buzzy Drootin and Buddy Rich, even though on paper they're very different players. But the way they would do that, it would really sort of blend in with the music. The snare drum would be under the cymbal, and sometimes on recordings you can't even really hear it that clearly because it just kind of blends in. But one where you can hear it really well with Buzzy is a Herb Hall recording called Old Time Modern. And the way it's recorded, you can really hear Buzzy's left hand on the snare drum clearly, and you can hear him doing that at all different tempos, and kind of playing it near the edge. And then he would sort of dance around with his left hand, so he'd be doubling the ride beat, but then he'd also throw a lot of little shuffle figures in there. And in fact, his feel could often have this very propulsive shuffle kind of feel, or at a faster tempo, it became a little more like a train kind of feel, which was also different from George Wettling, but he'd still have that snare drum going like. And then, so he'd play some shuffle things and different little press roll accents, and he would put the accents in unusual places. Again, he wasn't coming so much directly from a Baby Dodds kind of thing, so where often in this music there's a lot of accents on beat 4, and I talked about that with George Wettling. George Wettling played in a lot of 2-bar phrases, and there'd often be an accent on beat 4 of every other bar, or he'd play around with that beat 4. But as much as you would think of that as part of that style, Buzzy pretty much never did that. And his accents would tend to be more on the and of 2 or the and of 4, more on the offbeat. And if you were just to write out what he was playing with his hands, it would seem, I think, like maybe what a drummer in a different style might be playing. But then he always had a strong 4/4 bass drum, and that was sort of the thing that anchored all of this together. And he could be doing these different things with his hands on top of that, but there was always this really strong beat. So he would do things kind of like kind of thing that Sid Catlett and Joe Jones were great at, where he could just be kind of simmering for a while and then suddenly have one accent that just really pop out, and it might be just one accent in a whole 32-bar chorus, but it would really grab you when he did it. But all that stuff with that left hand just dancing around like that, he had such control over it, and it really just gives this great feel. And again, when you hear him in a band, it's just kind of underneath the music. It's not oppressive. And another thing he was a master of was the backbeat. And he would mix the backbeat in, still doubling the ride, but often accenting 2 and 4 as a rim shot. And you would get this kind of thing going. And he just had a beautiful sound and feel with it. And he was one of those players who could keep that backbeat going for a long time and still have it sound really hip and swinging. As I've talked about before, that can be hard to do, but he was really a master of that, and part of it was the great sound that he got. And then another thing that he could do was he was a master at bringing the backbeat in and out of the music, which is also hard to do, because when you add a backbeat in, that can add some excitement, but then once you have it there, if you take it away again, things can feel empty. But somehow, Buzzy had a way of doing this. There's a Sidney Bechet recording, Bechet at Storyville, and on there, you'll hear Buzzy playing, and maybe if Bechet or Vic Dickinson is taking a second chorus, for the first few bars of their second chorus, Buzzy will bring the backbeat in, and it really kind of gives things a lift. But then he'll maybe play a little fill or something, and then go back to how he was playing before. But just somehow the way he does it, he's able to get the excitement, the added excitement of the backbeat, but then not lose it and not be boxed into it, but still get the effect of it. So that's another thing to check out, because I always thought that was brilliant how he did it. And just another aspect of his ensemble playing on ballads, he would often do a double time feel, even a pretty aggressive double time feel on ballads, and you can hear him doing that a lot. Almost on any ballad he plays, if it's slow enough, he'll do that. And that is something also that I feel is kind of coming from Dave Tuff. I think Dave Tuff was one of the first people to do that. So again, I just recommend you check him out. Let me give you some recordings to listen to. These are just some of my favorites. He recorded a ton. There's a lot of great stuff. But Ringside at Condon's, that's a great one, the Eddie Condon band. And on there, you can hear him with that setup where he has the ride cymbal, the Chinese cymbal, and the little cymbal. So you can hear him do some of that Dave Tuff kind of stuff. And switch back and forth between the ride and the Chinese cymbal. Also, he would ride a lot on that half-open hi-hat. He didn't play as much open and closed hi-hat as some guys, but he really used the hi-hat a lot as a ride cymbal, so you'll hear that a lot too. So Ringside at Condon's is a great one. Jazz Ultimate by Bobby Hackett and Jack Teagarden, that's one of my favorite recordings ever. Buzzy sounds great on that. On that one, I think he's just using one ride cymbal and a hi-hat. Sounds great. Bobby Hackett at the Embers is a great recording where you can hear Buzzy mostly on brushes. He does play sticks on a few tunes, but he's mostly on brushes. And he was a great brush player, just has a really smooth swinging sound. And then to hear the brushes, the way he has his snare drum set up, it's a really nice sound. That's one I've always liked a lot. I mentioned Herb Hall, Old Time Modern, and Bechet at Storyville. Those are some good ones. There are more I'll mention in the next video about his soloing, because he really had this way of phrasing that is kind of unlike anyone else in jazz. It was really just his own thing. So I guess I'll leave it there, but I'll be back at some point soon with part 2, Buzzy Drootin, and I just recommend listening to any recordings you can find of him. He's as great as anyone. I would put him up there, honestly, with any drummer in the history of jazz. There are drummers obviously who had more effect on drumming history, but just in terms of swinging and having one's own unique style, I would put Buzzy up there with anyone. So thanks a lot for watching. I'll be back soon.